Okay, as I mentioned in the last video, we're going to take a look at this page here, homeandlearn.co.uk net/bb.net.html. And let's see. So I think we will now look at this, even though we've done it to some degree, but I think that we need to check this a little again. So this is about functions and subprocedures. So we've done this. You were supposed to have done it, but let's look at it again. So if you recall, we used this function before, and this would grab part of a string, and you could say where you want to start and how much of that string you want. So if you remember, we had something, we would have something like this, this would be a string, declared as a string, and then we could assign it a value, and then we could apply the substring to this variable. So this is like we said before, variables are objects, and so they have methods associated with them, and string objects have substring method. So we can call up this method, and this means what? Start at the fourth character and capture 4 characters, and then we could display, we could assign that to the same string and then display the result. So anyway, that's an example. This substring is an example of a method or a function. There's also an equals function. So he says these functions are built into Visual Basic. But if you could see under the hood, what you'd find is some code to do these jobs for you. So in other words, somebody had to write something to make that work. He says, but you don't have to worry how Visual Basic gets your answer, because the code is all wrapped up in a function and ready for you to use over and over again. Okay, so what in this lecture, this week's lecture, we're going to go through a bunch of functions, and what your homework will be is to make a list of similar functions that you can use in your final project. So you have a final project, and you're supposed to start working on it, and we're going to go through a bunch of examples of functions we're going to build, and then you're going to make a list of functions that you could build and you could use for your final project. So you're supposed to say what the function is, or you're supposed to give the code for the function, as it may not be perfectly correct for your final project because you haven't done your final project yet. But anyway, it should be working function, and then you should explain where you expect to use it in your final project. So for each function I mentioned here that you should do this for, you should do that. So he says that's the point. Functions and subs are code that you want to use over and over again, and you don't have to keep writing that code over and over again because you have it as a function. So here's an example of a function, and here's an example that you should try to write. So he says, think about when you have a form and people are supposed to fill in the form, and there are lots of text boxes there. So you want to make sure that the user is entering the correct data. For example, if it's a name box, you don't want them to put a number. So to check that the user has entered the correct data, you write some error checking code. Except that you might have lots of text boxes on the form. If you want to check all the text boxes, then you'd have to write the same checking code for each text box. Instead of doing that, you can write your own function or sub. You only have to write it once. Okay? That's the idea. Okay, next he says, what's the difference between a function and a sub? Now, we've talked about this, but let's review it. Remember that a function returns a value and a sub does not return a value. Now, a message box, you might say, well, that returns a value because it returns a value to the screen, but that's not what we mean by return a value. It means that you can assign that value to some variable, and that's not what you do with message box. So it has an output, like the square root of x is a function, because you take the square root of 9 and you can assign that to some variable, right? The square root of 9 is 3, and you will assign that result to some variable. You don't assign a message box to some variable, generally speaking, right? It does have an output, so to speak, but it's not an output into the code itself. It's an output to the user. It's different. Okay, so functions return a value and subs don't. So substring is a function, right? Because it returns a value. You saw here this returns a value. In fact, I picked up that value in here. On the other hand, a sub is some code or job that you want VB to get on with and execute. An example is closing a form down and unloading it with me close. So that will close down the form. You don't need to return a value here. You just want VB to close your form down. So he says, here's an example. So we're going to create our own sub. And he says, by the way, sub is short for subroutine. Here's what we're going to do. So we're going to have a text box on a form, and it's going to be first name, text box. And then we want to check that the user has actually entered something into it. So we're going to write a sub that will check this. So he says, start a new project and put a text box on your new form. Put a button on the form. Double click your button to see the coding window, and add the following code for the button. Okay, so you should do this. Dim text box as string. So we're defining a string, and then we're using this function, and we're applying it to textbox1.text. Remember, we have a text box. It's called, I guess it should be called textbox1. We're going to get its text, which we can do, and then we're going to apply the trim function to it, and then if it's empty, next line, I'm sorry, we're going to apply the trim function and give that to this variable, and then if this variable is empty, right, that's two pairs of quotation marks, then we have a message box. Otherwise there's no message box that's generated. Now he says try it out, and if you don't enter anything into the text box but you just click the button, you should see this message, right? So now he says, okay, we could do this, but if you had a lot of text boxes, you'd have to do this for each one. So how about creating a function that will, or a subroutine that will do this, and then we can just so-called call up or call that subroutine, and we won't have to rewrite the code all the time. So he says, okay, let's create a sub. So let's type this out. Private sub error check, like that. Okay, now make sure that you don't do it inside the button, because if we did it inside the button, that this would only be available inside the button, and that's not the point. So and do it inside our form class, but before the end of the class. So do it somewhere like here, right, like that. And then he says when you do that, when you put this in there, then Visual Basic will add this at the end for you. He says this name error check is just his idea. You don't have to use, I mean, he just made up that name. You could call it almost anything we liked, but it's better to stick to something descriptive. So he says you'd have something like this. Your code window will look like this one. We have the button stuff up here, but here we have our new code. Now cut the code from your button and paste it between these two lines. So take this stuff here. Take this stuff here and put it in there. He says when you've done that, now you've created your own subroutine. And this subroutine is called error check. Okay, so now it should look like this, right? Yeah, here it is. We decided just the same code we had before, but now it's in here. And then he says, okay, now you have to call this function. You have to, otherwise it's not going to run. Functions don't just run. You have to write them down. So he says type this in to the button click, and now instead of having all the code in the button click, we just have this. We're just calling that same code, but we're calling it as a function now. So try it now and see if it works, and if you get the same result as you did before. And you should. In fact, he says you don't have to use this word actually. You can just write this, and that's sufficient. So you can take that out. He says the call keyword makes your code easier to read and tells you that you are executing your own subroutine on this line. Okay. So you can call this subroutine, your error check subroutine, from lots of different places. He says you can put a new button on the screen and put this call error check again in the new button, and if you click on the button after you're running the form, it should do the same thing. So Visual Basic gives us the ability to write our own functions. And when we can write our own functions, it makes us think more logically about what we're doing, and it also makes it, kind of easier to use, because you don't have to keep typing the same code over and over again. And also, if you look at it, if you compare having all this from here to here in your button versus just having this is kind of much easier to understand and much easier to read. So that's another advantage. Okay, now we're going to talk about parameters, which this is spelt wrong, right? Should be parameter. But anyway, remember parameters are functions take parameters. You can have one parameter, no parameters, or more than one parameter. So let's go to that, but let's stop this video here.